election. Tensions in the country continue to rise amidst anxiety as to whether we will have an election. The Supreme Court will today rule on a case as to whether or not to postpone the election in the wake of several unresolved issues just 24 hours to the election. It is an election that has major implications for East Africa's largest economy. Today, Raila Odinga will be giving a major announcement, a way forward for his supporters after withdrawing from the presidential race. The Supreme Court now has the fate of the country in its hands. We'll be discussing this in studio with Joy Brenda Divo, who is a lawyer and a political analyst, as well as political analyst Mark Bichachi. Ladies and gentlemen, many thanks for joining us on Kivumbi 2017.
Thank you for having us.
Right, so it is 23 hours and counting to the election. Supreme Court, big case there today that will really decide whether we'll have an election tomorrow. But Raila Odinga also giving his way forward for his supporters. Let's begin with an interview he had on BBC yesterday, really seemingly going back on his word, saying they did not, first of all, call for the mother of all protests on Thursday, the election day, as has been reported, but says the supporters will stay away. Joy, what is he likely to say today?
Today, like we were just saying offset, the announcement would either be really huge or it would be really nothing. It's one of those things where he has proved his name, Agwambo. He's been such an enigma. And every time we think that he has run out of his bag of tricks, he pulls out another rabbit out of the hat. Case in point is what he said on the BBC yesterday, because all of us had him categorically saying that 26th there'll be no elections. In fact, there'll be the mother of all demonstrations. It's something that all Kenyans had and all Kenyans understood. But now yesterday, when I was listening to the interview, I remember I cocked my head. I was like, did I just hear that? Did that really happen? But the way he spoke, and as emphatic as he was, seems to have been, in my opinion, I had the heart of a statesman now coming out. Because I was like, you know what? If people had come out tomorrow, there would have been really, really had police presence. There would have been definitely people who'd get beaten, people who'd get hurt. So I was sort of glad that he insisted on that angle, because it made me see, okay, fine. Whatever else he has in mind now, at least he has realized people might get hurt and decided to say, you know what, you'd rather not come out. So, because in fact, on where I come from, the word on the street was, kesho unapiga kura ma utapigwa. So guys were getting ready to either vote or to get beaten on that day during demonstrations.
And many are saying it's something that has probably lowered fears that there will be violence in the country during the elections. But Mark, what do you make of this, seemingly going back on his word and clarifying what they had called for the 26th of October? Because he says, though, that on the issue of protests, it is something they will clarify on further today for their supporters, but peaceful protests. Where does this border? Because I saw an interesting meme going around yesterday, something along the lines of, if people are being shot outside and your father has a cigarette addiction and keeps sending you to the shop to buy cigarettes on the streets nonetheless. And despite the fact that once a while you come home with a bloodied arm, he continues to send you out for the same cigarettes. And so when you get shot outside, whose fault is it that you got shot? Your thoughts on that?
Oh, very interesting. And let me start with Raila's statement at the BBC, leading into your statement. Raila's statement at the BBC can be understood, as Joy has interpreted it, a statesman who's speaking to a nation. However, the BBC is an international media outlet. So maybe this is a message to the international gallery. And in the international gallery, Raila is very careful not to brand himself as an instigator of vigilantism, as an instigator of election malpractice, as an instigator of the removal of the rights of the people who want to vote. And if I were him, and I'm speaking to the international community, and I'm also speaking to Bensouda of the ICC, then definitely I will distance myself as much as I can to any form of violence or any form of incitement. So that is a statement I expected him to make on BBC. Today, if he's on Ramaugi or any of those local stations, what he says there, that is more true than what he said at BBC. That being said, when your father sends you out for cigarettes and you get shot in the arm, the reality of the matter is the person at fault is your father. Why is that the case? Because any leader lays his life down for the sheep. Anytime the sheep lay down lives down for the shepherd, then that shepherd is a false shepherd. That shepherd is a wolf in sheep's clothing. Now, this moment in Kenyan history will be judged not on the veracity of the truths that was spoken, but on which leader decided, I am going to lay down my life for the sake of my sheep. Right now, what we have seen from the leaders that we have is my life is so important. My position is so important. Let everything else happen. Let every baby be hit on the head. Let every protester come out. Let whatever happens, happen so that I can get an opportunity at the highest seat in the land.
And we'll get back to that because many times they say blood has to be shed for change to happen in cases like this. But if you don't know what we're talking about, NASA leader Raila Odinga has denied ever instructing his supporters to demonstrate tomorrow during the fresh presidential election. In an exclusive interview with BBC Africa yesterday, Odinga said they had only urged his supporters to keep off from the polling stations. But on Monday, Odinga, who withdrew from the presidential race, announced resumption of street protests with what they described as the mother of all demonstrations slated for Thursday. Listen in.
We will not tell people to demonstrate on the polling day. We will not say that at all. We will tell the people to stay away.
Just to clarify, Mr. Odinga, you're not calling on your supporters to take to the streets on that day. You're telling them to stay at home.
Yes.
So Raila Odinga there to give another big announcement today on the way forward for his supporters. But the fact that his name is still on the ballot and ballot papers have already been printed, the last consignment arrived yesterday. I mean, is there any possibility, Joe, that he could be perhaps going back on his withdrawal and saying, let's go to the polls, let's vote, and perhaps take this to the court later?
But that would be, it would be a little bit too late for him to do that, I think, because their message has been very consistent that there will be no voting on that day, there will be no voting on that day, such that his forces have already been demobilized. So if he comes back and says, by the way, let's go ahead and vote, for example, the story that you just ran in your earlier segment about transportation to places where people who are going to vote, many of his supporters would be voting back at home. If you've not left Nairobi by today, you're not making it home by tomorrow. Most of the buses that carry people home also have been kept away because people don't want violence on the door and the buses to be burned. So it's going to be very difficult for him to marshal the sort of support that he ordinarily has. But that being said, I expect some people to turn up at the polls and still vote for him because, I mean, if you're keen on voting and the person you're keen on voting on is Raila Odinga, you will still give him your vote.
Right.
What will be interesting will be seeing the leaderboard by the end of the day, and maybe people like Abduba Dida or Ekuru Ekot might be performing better than Honorable Raila. But that being said, it's just in line with his message. If he goes back and says, no, actually, I will be participating, I'll be very surprised because that would have been effectively shooting himself in the foot. I expect that he will stay consistent with, let's not vote that even if the showing is really bad, you can say, but after all, you weren't participating. You weren't expecting anything else.
Right. But even if there is an election tomorrow, let's take a look at what might possibly happen. I mean, without Raila Odinga on the ballot, it is clear that Uhuru Kenyatta will win with a landslide. Let's take a look at NASA's strategy of boycotting the election to render the results illegitimate. Is that something, first of all, that is likely to hold water, considering many are saying it is against the very basic fundamental rights of Kenyans who wish to vote?
You know, one of the key things, whenever a candidate in any election withdraws their candidature, there are two things that immediately become important. Number one is voter turnout, and number two, how many people who support this particular candidate stay away. Now, we know in the last election we had 15 million voters. How many of those 15 million will stay away? And how many of those who show up will vote for Uhuru Kenyatta? Now, in this particular instance, Raila has weaved himself into an interesting corner. Number one, every single person who shows up to vote, even if they're showing up to vote for him, is voting in disobedience of Raila. Okay? So that's a statement in and of itself, that you've told people not to come out and vote. Every person who comes out to vote is voting in defiance of Raila Odinga. That's number one. Number two, it will be very, very unlikely for him to say that he's coming back into the race, because then it is pointless. Why is it pointless? Because number one, let's remember that yesterday, some of his lieutenants in their rallies, which by the way are another question, because are those campaigns what are they? Because he is still a candidate. So public gatherings such as that could be considered campaigns. But that being a side story, you had them say, in my region, there'll be no elections. In my constituency, there'll be no elections. So definitely we have a situation where if he pulls back today, it's too late to marshal and mobilize those votes. So it won't work. So what will happen tomorrow? Likelihood is this, that in some certain areas, we will see supporters of NASA either out of their own passion or led by the leaders going and trying to stop people from voting. We will see suppressed voter turnout within some NASA regions. But according to the law, if two people in a constituency show up to vote, and those two people voted for Uhuru Muigai Kenyatta, then he has 100% of that vote. It is not 100% of the people who didn't show up. It is the people who showed up that count. So what you are most likely to see, you're likely to see in an election map, which the media houses will show, you're likely to see a Kenya painted red by Jubilee. All right, and of course in the polling stations, the 2 or 3 returning officers are probably also registered voters who are likely to vote in the same polling stations. But depending on what Raila Odinga says today, Brenda, what really are the options for the country's fate after the end of voting tomorrow?
One of the things that, of course, will be developing through the day is turnout. That's something that's going to be very telling as to whether or not we have the 290 plus 1 for diaspora constituencies actually participating in the voting. Another thing that will be developing through the day also is, as Mark said, the areas that are considered flashpoints, because there are places where they have already been declared that in this area, this is a flashpoint. We're expecting there'll be heightened security because already there has been something happening prior to the elections. Another thing that we'll see developing also is the people who actually insist on moving the process forward. Because we have seen some people saying, I'm a voter, because I've seen on Twitter, I'm a voter in Sierra and I will turn out to vote. I'm a voter in... So there are people who are trying to sort of break ranks. And tomorrow they'll make big stories because, as Mark says, if you're looking at the percentage of the voters, it's like you do with your polls on Twitter or wherever. You'll tell us 71% of the viewers say this, and it doesn't matter that you had 15 people polling, doing your poll, or 270. You'll just say it was 71% of the ones who voted. And that's the sort of thing we're going to see. By the end of the day, of course, because this is just the one position that we're doing, we'll expect results streaming in a lot faster than they were the last time. So that by about midnight, you start having the figures that are forming to see what sort of numbers we're talking about. Of course, the others who have been allowed to get in the race late in the day, we do not expect them to dent the results either way, because, I mean, somebody like Jirong was being gazetted yesterday. So it's one of those things where, I mean, it's more of an academic exercise than anything. All right, of course. But you will see 1 or 2 people who will decide theirs is a vote for against the status quo. So you're like, you know what, let me stand with Dida, let me stand with our court, because whoever is on the offering is not something that somebody I want to back, and maybe I just want to still get my voice heard. So by the end of the day, what you will be seeing is those sort of positions crystallizing. But what I'm also looking forward to seeing is how will the police conduct themselves. They've been very besieged by all these accusations. And they too have gotten to a place. Yesterday we were having the discussion that the policemen themselves, their nerves are really frayed. They feel besieged by the members of the public. They do not expect any sympathies from members of the public. And they too are not bearing much sympathy towards members of the public. So tomorrow, will there be provocation? Will there be confrontation? Will that be part of the story that we will see developing tomorrow? I really hope not. And I'm hoping with this thing of let's stay away, there won't be as much. But I'm sure in places where, like Mark was saying, where people mobilize to go and prevent people from voting. Remember last time we had the 400-meter rule? I'm sure that 400-meter rule now, this time, is going to be really, really enforced. So unless the action is taken into the villages and into the estates, we might also see some confrontation between members of the public who try to prevent others from voting and the ones who vote. And maybe the ones who actually manage to vote going back home, being seen with the inky finger and facing some backlash. So tomorrow is going to be one of those days where, fingers crossed, but it was going to be a very difficult day for many people.
Right, and of course, yeah, there's been calls for peace. You know, respect whoever wants to vote, respect whoever does not want to vote. But Mark, looking at your analysis of Raila Odinga's decision to clarify the demonstrations on Thursday on BBC, an international channel, what does it say, considering that international envoys have been very vocal about this election? I mean, just yesterday, they said U.S. Ambassador Robert Godek said they feel like IEBC has met NASA's irreducible minimums in many ways. I mean, they've been asking for the election to continue nonetheless. Could that have been a decision that influenced what he said on the BBC?
Absolutely. Let's not forget that his trip to the UK was not as successful as he had hoped. And there's, whenever you're doing the kind of movements we are seeing the politics of Kenya take, is you have to get the international backing so that in case of a crisis, they say, oh, poor dear, we can help you. And that's really what you need, because if you're going to make any stand against status quo, you need to have international backing. So you've got to play to that gallery. But I think we all miss the point here. Let me tell you, with the kind of positions that we've taken, the election of the 26th is not going to be the end point, it's going to be a marker point. And the difference is this, that the election will deal with the Constitution, it will deal with the Supreme Court ruling, but it will not deal with the hearts of Kenyans. And the hearts of Kenyans, half of the country is injured, the other half is economically challenged because business is not happening, the other half is strained because they want life to go back to normal, and it's not. The other half is like, okay, what is in this country for us? So what is going to happen after the election might just be as important as the election itself. And one hopes that once we have a substantive elected leader, then that person will move away from a party position and be able to unify the country. That's the most critical thing. The understanding that the election will solve anything in this country is a misguided one. In fact, if anything what this election is going to show us, I bet you it will show us exactly what we saw in August 8th. A nation that is divided, and divided so much so that we believe that if the person I am not supporting becomes president, then Kenya will become hell for me. This is not true. But the unfortunate thing is that perception informs reality. And the perception that the other side, whatever your other side is the absolute bride of Satan. It tells you that after the election, there'll be people who feel like, my goodness, I am doomed. And whoever becomes president, it will behoove him to make the step, not to meet Raila Odinga or to meet Uhuru Kenyatta, but to meet the people of Kenya, and the people of Kenya to begin to address their heart issues. We need to get to the point where we ask ourselves, why do I as a Kikuyu dislike a certain tribe? Why do I as a Luo dislike a certain tribe? Until we answer that question, we can have 6 million elections and end up at the same place.
And we'll be discussing what that marker point that Mark is talking about in just a moment. This is the Dawn Debate on Kivumbi 2017, just about 5 minutes to the top of the hour. We take a short commercial break. Do stay with us. We'll be discussing this in a bit more detail in just a moment.